You've been trying to get better for a long time. You've read the books, listened to the podcasts, maybe sat across from a therapist and said all the right things. You understand your patterns, you can name your wounds. You know intellectually exactly what's keeping you stuck, and yet something doesn't move. Not fully. Not the way you expected it to after all this work. And in the quietest moments, the ones you don't share with anyone, you've wondered something you feel almost ashamed to admit. What if part of me doesn't actually want to heal? Not because you enjoy suffering. Not because you're broken in some unfixable way. But because something inside you has decided, for reasons that made complete sense once, that staying exactly as you are is safer than becoming who you could be. Today we're going to look at that part, not to judge it, not to fight it, but to understand it clearly enough that it finally loses its grip. Let's start with what this actually looks like in real life. Because it doesn't look like laziness. It doesn't look like giving up. It looks like progress followed by an invisible ceiling. You start therapy and the first few sessions feel like revelation. Then somewhere around the 6th or 7th week, you start arriving with less. You start talking in circles. The breakthroughs slow down and eventually stop, and you tell yourself you've gotten what you needed, even though you know you haven't, or you spend months building a new habit, a new routine, a new version of your life. And just when it begins to solidify, just when it starts to feel real, you quietly dismantle it. Not in one dramatic moment. In small, almost invisible steps. A skipped day becomes a skipped week, becomes a quiet return to exactly where you started. Or you meet someone healthy. Someone consistent and kind and genuinely interested in you. And instead of relief, you feel unease. A sense that something is missing. That this isn't quite real. And slowly, without deciding to, you find ways to create distance. Each time, there's a reasonable explanation. Life got busy, the timing was wrong, you just weren't ready yet. But underneath those explanations, if you're honest, there is something else. A pull, quiet, persistent, entirely below the level of conscious decision. A pull back toward the familiar. And here's what makes this so difficult to see clearly. The part of you that resists healing is not your enemy. It is not weakness. It is not failure. It is not evidence that you secretly want to suffer. It is one of the most sophisticated protective systems your mind has ever built. And it has been keeping you safe in its own way for its own reasons for a very long time. To understand what's actually happening, we need to go back to the origin of this pattern, not to assign blame. To achieve clarity. Every psychological adaptation you carry began as a solution. Something in your environment, your family system, your early relationships, the emotional climate you grew up inside, created conditions that required you to develop certain strategies to survive. Maybe the environment was unpredictable. So you learned to stay small and quiet to avoid drawing attention to yourself. Maybe love was conditional, tied to performance, to being good, to not needing too much. So you learned to suppress your needs and present only the version of yourself that was acceptable. Maybe expressing emotions led to punishment or dismissal. So you learn to close down, to intellectualize, to process everything internally where no one could see it. These strategies worked. In the environment where they were built, they genuinely protected you. And here is where it gets complicated. Those strategies didn't just become habits. They became identity. The way you learned to be in order to survive became, over time, indistinguishable from who you are. Your smallness became your humility. Your need suppression became your self-sufficiency. Your emotional closure became your strength. These are not just coping mechanisms anymore. They are self-concepts. They are how you understand yourself. And healing, real healing, doesn't just ask you to adopt new behaviors. It asks you to become someone you don't yet fully recognize. Someone whose identity is built on entirely different foundations, and that is not nothing. That is an enormous ask. Now let's go into the mechanism. The actual psychological structure underneath this resistance. There is a concept in psychology called secondary gain. It refers to the hidden benefits that a problem or symptom provides. Benefits that are real and significant, even when the problem itself causes genuine suffering. The term sounds clinical. The reality is deeply human. When you have been struggling with something for a long time, anxiety, depression, relational patterns, identity confusion, that struggle becomes woven into the fabric of your daily life in ways that are hard to see until you start to remove it. Your anxiety keeps you from taking risks that might end in failure or humiliation. Your depression gives you permission to rest in a life that never taught you rest was allowed without being earned. Your relational patterns keep intimacy at a manageable distance in a world where closeness has historically meant eventual loss or pain. Your identity as someone who is working on themselves, always in process, never quite arrived, protects you from the exposure of actually being seen as you fully are. These are not trivial benefits. They are in many cases the only reliable forms of safety your nervous system has ever known. Here is the mental model that holds this most clearly. Imagine your psychological system as a city that was built for a specific climate. Every structure, every road, every building, every drainage system was designed for the conditions that existed when it was built. Cold winters, heavy rain, constant threat of flooding. Now the climate is changing. The winters are milder. The flooding is less frequent. But the city doesn't rebuild itself automatically. The old infrastructure is still there. It still functions. And the people who live in it have organized their entire lives around it. Healing is asking the city to rebuild while people are still living in it. Not just to add new structures, but to dismantle the old ones. The ones that protected everyone through decades of difficult weather, and trust that the new structures will hold. That is not a simple ask. That is a complete reorganization of everything that has kept you functional. And the part of you that resists it is not irrational. It is looking at the demolition and saying, are you absolutely certain the new building will be stronger than the one we're tearing down? It is a reasonable question. The answer is yes. But reason alone doesn't move a nervous system that learned its lessons from experience, not from argument. So what do you actually do? Not in the way of fighting this part of yourself into submission, but in the way of working with it intelligently, with the understanding that it cannot simply be overridden. It must be gradually persuaded. Here is the framework. The first step is to name the benefit honestly. This requires a particular kind of courage, the willingness to ask a question that feels almost dangerous. What is my struggle currently protecting me from? Not what are the negative effects of this pattern. You probably know those well. But what would I have to face or do or become if this pattern were fully resolved? For someone with chronic anxiety, without the anxiety, I would have to take risks I've been avoiding. I would be responsible for outcomes I've been protected from by the anticipation of catastrophe. For someone with relational patterns, without these patterns, I would have to be fully seen by another person. I would have to trust in a way that has historically led to pain. For someone whose identity is built around being in recovery, without the struggle, who am I? What do I talk about? What gives my life meaning and direction? Write these down. Not to shame yourself for having them, but because the secondary gain that remains unconscious has enormous power over your behavior. The secondary gain you can name and look at directly that you can actually work with. The brain's threat response is significantly reduced when the threat is named and examined rather than felt as a vague background dread. This is why journaling is not just a coping mechanism, it is a neurological intervention. Putting the unnamed fear into language moves it from the subcortical threat processing systems toward the prefrontal cortex, where it becomes something that can be reasoned with. A real-life example: someone who has struggled with social anxiety for years finally asks this question seriously. The answer that surfaces is, without the anxiety, I have no excuse to stay home. I have to actually show up in my life. And I don't know if the life I have is one I want to show up for. That's a completely different problem, and a far more solvable one than anxiety. The second step is to negotiate with the resistant part rather than overpower it. This comes from internal family systems theory, the idea that the psyche is not a single unified entity, but a collection of parts, each with its own history, its own logic, its own protective function. The part of you that resists healing is a part, not all of you. And like any protective entity, it responds very differently to being heard than to being attacked. When you push hard against this resistance, when you try to force yourself into healing through willpower and self-discipline, the protective part escalates. It is doing its job. It sees the pressure as threat and increases its response accordingly. What works instead is a kind of internal dialogue. Not literally talking to yourself in a way that feels strange or theatrical, but pausing when you feel the resistance and asking it a genuine question. What are you worried will happen if I actually get better? And then, and this is the part most people skip, actually listening for the answer. It usually comes as a feeling rather than a thought, a heaviness, a tightening, an image. Let it be there without immediately trying to fix or dismiss it. A real-life example: someone who repeatedly stops going to therapy just before any real breakthrough. When they pause and ask this question, what surfaces is, if I heal this, I have nothing left to blame. Everything after this is my own responsibility. That is not a reason to stay sick, but it is a real fear. And it deserves to be met with understanding, not contempt. The third step is to shrink the definition of healing. One of the things that makes the resistant part escalate is the enormity of what healing seems to require. Becoming a completely different person. Rebuilding your entire relational world. Resolving everything. Arriving somewhere final and stable where the struggle is over. That version of healing is terrifying. It requires the demolition of your entire current identity. And it's also not what healing actually is. Healing is not a destination. It is a direction. It is not the replacement of your entire psychological structure. It is the gradual, imperfect expansion of what is available to you. You are not trying to become someone unrecognizable. You are trying to give the current version of yourself slightly more freedom than it had yesterday. The brain responds very differently to small, non-threatening increments than to large, identity-level demands. This is the neuroscience of incremental change. The prefrontal cortex can process and approve small steps without triggering the amygdala's threat response. Large-scale change reads as threat. Small, safe, reversible experiments read as information. A real-life example: instead of committing to being fully emotionally open in your relationship, which feels enormous and exposing, you commit to one moment of genuine honesty per week, not a transformation, a single small act. The nervous system can tolerate that. And over time, those small acts accumulate into a different baseline. The fourth step is to grieve what healing costs. This is the one most people never do. Because it sounds strange. Why would you grieve getting better? But there are real losses in healing. If you heal the pattern of emotional unavailability, you lose the protection it provided. If you heal the identity of the person who is always struggling, you lose the community and purpose it gave you. If you heal the anxiety, you lose the excuse it offered. These losses are real. They deserve acknowledgement. Not dramatization, not a reason to stay stuck. Just honest recognition that something is being released, not just gained. Grief, in psychology, is not a sign of weakness. It is the process by which the nervous system completes an experience and releases its hold on it. Without grief, the loss remains unprocessed, and the part of you that knows what was lost continues to resist the change that caused it. A real-life example, someone who grew up as the family's struggling one. The person everyone worried about and rallied around realizes that healing means losing that role. Losing the attention, the care, the centrality in the family system that their struggle provided. Grieving that loss, actually sitting with it, naming it, feeling it, allows them to separate the need for connection from the need to struggle. Let's bring this together. Here's the model that holds everything. You are not a single self trying to heal. You are a system of parts, some moving toward change, some moving away from it, each responding to the conditions it was built inside. The part that resists healing is not your enemy. It is the oldest protector you have. It has been doing its job, imperfectly but faithfully, for as long as you can remember. You cannot defeat it. You cannot argue it into silence. You cannot override it with willpower or discipline or the right information. But you can meet it with understanding. You can name what it's protecting you from. You can negotiate with it rather than attack it. You can shrink the ask until it no longer reads as threat. You can grieve what healing costs, so the loss doesn't hold you in place. And slowly, not all at once, not in a straight line, the resistance softens, not because you conquered it, but because it finally understood that you were no longer going somewhere dangerous. That the change you were moving toward was not the demolition of everything it had worked so hard to protect, but the expansion of it. The part of you that doesn't want to get better is not a failure of character. It is evidence of how hard your mind has worked to keep you here, to keep you functional, to keep you surviving. And surviving was enough for a long time. But you are reading this, which means some part of you, some other part, is no longer satisfied with surviving. That part is not naive. It is not ignoring the risk. It is simply willing to find out what becomes available on the other side of the resistance. And that willingness, quiet, imperfect, unsteady as it is where every real change has ever begun. You don't have to be certain you want to heal. You just have to be curious enough to keep looking at. That is enough. That has always been enough.